This video is sponsored by Envato Elements. Envato provides over 1 million digital assets such as graphic elements, stock footage, fonts, music, and much more. So if you're interested, I have provided a link down below in the description which will take you to their website, and of course if you do decide to register, I get to earn a commission. Now in today's tutorial, we're going to be taking a look at how to create 3D titles within After Effects using Element3D. Before I say anything else, let's take a look at what we're going to be creating. As you can see, I've created 3 examples. We're firstly going to start with the Paranormal title, which, if you're not aware, was based off of the Paranormal stop motion film. And basically, once we go through the steps and create this one, then you're going to be able to recreate the other 2 as well, or any other 3D title for that matter. So that's why I'm going to cover the first 2 animations in more detail. As for the third title, which is obviously referencing Toy Story, I'm only going to give you a quick walkthrough for that one, since it follows the same principles but to a more extreme level. Now here are the timestamps for each of these titles in case you want to skip to any of them, which I don't recommend you should, because there's always going to be something new here and there for you to learn, even if you've been using After Effects for a long time. With all that said, let's jump right in and get started. Alright guys, so here we are now in After Effects, and as you can see down here I have the Paranormal, Monster and Toy Story compositions opened up. These are the original ones, but we'll leave them there just in case we forget something or we want to get back to them. Anyway, let's go ahead and create a new composition by going up to Composition, New Composition, and let's just name this Paranormal Tutorial. Let's leave it at 1080p, frame rate of 30 seems fine, and then a duration of 15 seconds is okay, so let's OK. Now let's zoom in here and click on the text tool, then click and drag and just type in Paranormal. And for this one I use the Creepy Crawlers font, and I'll make sure to include all the fonts and all the materials that we use in this tutorial in the project files down below in the description. Then we can click on Y to bring up the anchor point tool, and then click on this anchor point and hold down Control, and you can snap to each of these corners, or we'll just snap it to the middle. Or you can also use Control Alt Home, and then Control Home to center it to the composition like this. Now let's click S to bring up the scale this up a bit. And now let's go over to Layer, New Solid. You can use Control Y as well. We'll just name this Element3D and hit OK. Now we're going to add the Element3D plugin, and to do that I'm going to click Control Space, and this is going to bring up the FX Console plugin, which is also from videocopilot.net, but this one is free, so that's cool. And just type in Element and hit enter, and it'll automatically add that effect to this layer, instead of you having to go up to Effect, Video Copilot, whatever, or even using the Effects and Presets bar, which as you can see is sometimes a bit laggy. Let's go down to Custom Layers, and under Custom Text, you can see there's Path Layer number 1, and we'll set that to Paranormal Text that we just created, and then we'll go over to the Scene Setup, and once we're here, we can simply click Extrude, and there you go, we already have our 3D text. Now, since I'm using Element 2.2, it adds this extrusion model to a group. So let's just click and drag that out of it and just delete the group since we don't need it. Now, before we mess with any of these settings, let's go back to the composition so we can see what that looks like in the composition itself. Let's turn off the text and let's create a new camera. Maybe make it 35mm. Now we can use the unified camera tool. You can also use these separate ones, which is Orbit, Track, and Track Z. But instead, I like to use this one and simply use the shortcuts. Left click to Orbit, right click to Track in and out, and then middle click to move around. So let's go back to Element3D and go back into Scene Setup. What we can do now is go over the settings. You can click this drop down arrow and you can see there's the bevel, and this is basically the text itself. And if you go back to the extrusion model, you can see here it says bevel copies, and we can choose 2 or maybe even 3, and you can see those bevels being created. But for this one specifically, we're only going to be using 1 bevel. So let's go back and just set the bevel copies back to 1. Under the custom path here, we have custom path 1. So remember, we set that in the Element3D custom layers panel. Whatever custom path you choose here is what's going to be shown in the extrusion. And we got a bunch of other settings here, which we're not going to be going through all of them, but let's just cover some main ones. So we got path resolution, and this is basically the number of polygons that you want to have on your text to make it as smooth as possible. So let's go down to low, and you can zoom in here. By the way, I'm using the scroll wheel to zoom in and out, the left click to orbit around. While zooming in with a scroll wheel, you can hold down shift, which will make it much slower and more precise. And also while holding shift, you can left click and drag around, which will change the lighting. Also, you can change the lighting down here with some pre-made lighting setups, which won't affect the overall look in the composition unless you actually set it to the Element3D panel, which I'm going to show you later. So this is just to give you a better idea of how this bevel is going to behave in different lighting conditions. But for this one, we don't need it, so we'll just set it back to single light. And as we were talking about the path resolution, you can see up here the vertices count and the faces count. You can see that goes up as soon as we click on these more extreme values. Now this is extreme, which is too extreme, and I'm thinking we'll just leave it at low for now. Moving down, you have basically all the transforms that you usually have within After Effects. So you got the anchor point. If you want to change that, you scale it, it'll scale down from that point. You have some presets here, or you can just manually tweak it. Alright, for now, let's go back to the bevel and start working on the look for this guy. Over here, we got the bevel settings, and basically the extrusion is self-explanatory, so let's make that a bit higher, so maybe like 3. I think in the original one, what I did is I expanded the edges inward, because if you zoom in here between the R and the M, you see they kind of overlap, so let's make that -1. And then the bevel size, if we zoom in here, and let's just go down to the bevel segments and set that to 0. And this will give us a chiseled look. And this way we can see better what the bevel size and the bevel depth do. So let's increase the bevel size and then increase the bevel depth, so you can better understand what's going on with these values. Anyway, let's just bring the bevel depth down, maybe 1. And then the bevel size, just shrink that down. And then we can bring the bevel segments back to 3. Alright, now there's a bunch of other settings here that we're going to be going through maybe later, but not for now. So let's go ahead and click OK. Now let's go ahead over to the camera and click P, bring up the position, hold Shift A, point of interest, and then right click and reset both of these. Before we do anything else in here, let's go back to the text. Let's turn that on. Drag it down so we can see it. And what I did in the original example is I went to the character and I selected this P letter, scaled it up, and as you can see, it's automatically updating live, which is great. And the good thing about Element3D is responsive, but it's also very fast. Now let's go ahead and shut this off again. And as I said in the intro, I use the logo of Paranormal stop motion film as a reference for this. So let's go over to stuff. Let's bring it in the comp. Let's just drag it over. Let's just scale it down and bring it over here at the bottom. We can even select the Element3D layer and just bring it over here just so we can see it better, and then we'll bring it back in the middle. Maybe bring this on top. The original one has this sort of like curve at the bottom. The camera is also on a low angle, so we can click the camera, and by holding down Shift and orbiting, you can actually snap vertically, so you don't just orbit like this and lose control. And now let's zoom out. I'm clicking V to bring up the selection tool and then H to bring up the pan tool. Or you can be on the selection tool and just hold middle click and pan around like this. Now, of course, I'm pretty sure they went in and customized the hell out of this. We turn this to full. You see there's so much more detail here. Like you got these pieces of like hair sticking out and stuff like that. Every letter is basically resting on other letters as well. Like you got the P perfectly resting on A here, and you can see there's like a curve on the A letter. And you can do that as well if you can work with like say Illustrator or whatever, and then bring that in here and extrude that custom design. But for the sake of this tutorial, we'll just go with this one. Anyway, let's go back to Element3D, and what we can do now is we can use these deform tools to maybe make it look as close as possible to the original one. And one thing I didn't explain is that Element works in groups. So if you go back to the scene setup, you can see over here this number represents the group that this layer is in. Element3D supports up to 5 groups, and since this one is group number 1, you can go back, hit OK. You can see that whatever we do to this group 1 panel is going to affect our text. So we got the particle look size, and under particle look down here you can see it says deform. Now let's go down to taper and let's enable that. And what we can do now is increase the amount and kind of like stretches it. And so I think I did it at 0.5 or like 0.05. This is just a subtle deformation. And then we can go down to the origin and maybe play around with the orientation, 180. So it's kind of like stretching at the top here. You can go over to bend and then enable that and increase the angle. So maybe like 35. And of course, the look of this all depends on what kind of style or what kind of design you're going for. So just keep that in mind. You can experiment freely. This is just for the tutorial. But once you understand all of these steps and all of these tools, then you can really incorporate it into your own work. And of course, I say this just in case it turns out to be total garbage, because most of the time, the original example doesn't really match with the tutorial example that we do. In this case, I'll just shift the blame to you by saying, just make sure you experiment. And if it doesn't turn out well, the blame is all on you. All right, back to the tutorial. Maybe just give it a bit more of a taper here. And then maybe the bend is a bit too much. Maybe change the orientation. So yeah, as I said before, just make sure you experiment with this. Now, one thing I'm noticing here is this R and M are not really in contact, as you can see if you orbit a bit around. But from this angle, it does look like they're intersecting. So let's bring the paranormal text back on. Let's shut this off. And let's just select this R and let's just increase the gap. Turn this back off. And now we can select the element layer and right-click transform reset to bring it back to the middle. All right, now let's go ahead and start texturing this text, and let's use this as a reference. So let's go ahead and create a new solid by going up to layer, new solid. Let's name this noise texture. And what we'll do now is pre-compose this. So let's go ahead and over to layer, pre-compose, or Control-Shift-C. Let's just name this texture comp. And move all attributes and hit OK. Now, before we move inside of the comp, let's go ahead and click on this paranormal logo, Control-C to copy it, then go inside and then Control-V to paste it. And in here, we'll just right click and turn this into a guide layer. And what a guide layer does is basically makes it so that we can see it in this comp, but when we render it or when we bring it over here, it's not really visible. All right, now if we zoom in here and we have the resolution in full, you can see it's got like a very noisy kind of texture. It's got these black specks here and it's got these white little specks here. I don't know if you can see them because of YouTube compression maybe. And mainly it has this green color which fades into like a purplish magenta kind of color. It has these sort of like cracks at the bottom as well. So let's try to recreate that look. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna be using fractal noise to generate the texture and then play around with some other materials that I prepared for us today. Okay, so back to the solid, let's Control Space to bring up the FX console again and type in fractal noise and boom, we got some clouds. Now back to the fractal noise, we got fractal type. Let's set that to maybe like dynamic and then noise type to linear because we don't want it to be as soft. Then we can increase the contrast and decrease the brightness a bit. Let's move down to transform and maybe scale this down quite a lot because we want this to be kind of like a noisy texture. And then over to sub settings, we got sub influence. You see what that does. It's kind of like a secondary transform, if you will. And then sub influence gives this sort of sharpness. We don't want to overdo it. Now, if we were to animate it, you can just use the evolution value down here. And you can basically just alt click on this stopwatch and type in time times say 150. And so every second it'll shift by a value of 150. But we're not going to use it in this tutorial. I just wanted to show you for the sake of showing you. All right, so once we got that locked in, maybe we can duplicate this and let's just increase the scale a bit. And let's go down here. Let's just turn the opacity down quite a bit. Maybe set this to screen or maybe even soft light. And then decrease the opacity of this too. Now let's go back to the project tab and let's drag in this green texture that I got. Let's turn this off for now and let's just scale this down. And we don't want the texture to be as big. So what I did in the original example is I just shrunk this down and then I added this effect called CC Reptile. What this does is just repeats it. So if we increase the expand right and the expand left and then expand down and expand up. Now we don't want it to be repetitive like this. Instead, we'll just use the tiling of random. And then also let's just Control Space, add a fast blur, just increase that and just repeat edge pixels. Set this to quarter for now. I think we should increase it even more. Now what we can do is set this to soft light. Now let's go ahead and bring this grunge texture on top of the green texture. Let's click W to bring up the rotation tool. And then click and drag to rotate and hold down shift to snap it by 45 degrees. Maybe scale it down, bring it lower like that. Control Space CC Reptile, expand down because we actually rotated this. And let's go ahead and set this to unfold. So it just unfolds like that. Now let's go ahead and select the mask tool up here, or you can use the Q to toggle between the different shapes. And let's just click and drag to select the rectangle tool. and click and drag here at the bottom, and then click F to bring up the feather and just feather this out like crazy. And we'll set the transfer mode to multiply, which will get rid of all the white and leave us with only the cracks or the blacks. Then click T to bring up the opacity, maybe bring this down a bit. And what I'm noticing here is that this fractal noise texture, let's just turn these both off for now, is a bit too big. So maybe this bigger one, let's just name this big noise, small noise. This bigger one, maybe turn down the opacity and maybe increase the brightness and not as much contrast. Then go back to the small noise, maybe make this like 4 and increase the brightness a bit. And then turn the textures back on. Let's go ahead and create a new adjustment layer real quick and add a curves adjustment. Oops. Just bring this down and add a bit of contrast and maybe turn down this texture at the bottom a bit as well. Okay, now if we turn this back on, the original logo animation of Paranormal, we zoom in here, you can see there's these dark specks around the text and there's like these white small little specks. The way we can create that is by duplicating this small noise. Let's do that. Bring this on top and let's just solo it out for a second. Let's increase the contrast, increase the transform. Control space, add Luma key and say key out darker, for example. So what this does is just keys out any dark value. So we're left with all these small little particles that are all white. And then maybe we can scale these up a bit so we don't have as much. And then control space and add a simple choker as well. This will choke out these small size particles and we'll be left with just a few of these dots across the screen. And then if we unsolo this, you can see another level of detail and we can just duplicate this again. Let's name this white specks, black specks. And what we can do for this one is just rotate the evolution so it's not the same. And now we can just add a simple fill and make it black. Now we can just play around with these, just have a bigger black specks or even more, threshold down. But we don't want this to be overdone, slightly add some detail to it. Okay, now let's go ahead and duplicate this big noise again. Let's name this top noise and let's just select the mask tool, mask it around the top over here. We kind of like want a bigger texture to be over here at the top. And maybe let's just turn down the complexity a bit and maybe the transform just a bit, bring the brightness down and just feather this out like crazy. Now what we can do is create a new adjustment layer. Let's bring this at the bottom, this one. So let's call this CC. Let's call this color. And what we can do now is mask the bottom. And as I showed you in the beginning, there's this sort of like purple color at the bottom here. And so we want to be able to recreate that over here. So let's go ahead back to the color adjustment layer and control space, add the hue saturation effect. And what we can do now is just shift the hue. Let's bring this on top and move it out of the way. And then just shift this until it matches with that one. So maybe kind of like this color and we can just desaturate it a bit. And then of course, feather it out like crazy. And maybe even decrease the opacity a bit. We want all of these textures to be balanced with one another. And then we can add an adjustment layer all on top, which will affect all of these and just bring them back to normal, like add contrast to it and whatever. So let's go back to the CC layer now and let's control space, add a hue and saturation. And over here on the channel control, we can actually affect the individual channels. So let's go over to yellows. Let's just give it a slightly more bluish color and increase the saturation to give it more pop. And then we can go to magentas, increase the saturation a bit, and go back to master and just give it a bit more pop. +2. I think I did one more thing where I added this new adjustment layer, and let's rename this top CC and let's mask the top. And I just added a curves over here at the top and just brightened it up and then feathered it out. Now let's go back to the original CC layer. Let's give it a bit more contrast, not as much. We don't want to overdo it. And then there's this effect called highlights compression. And let's just bring this all the way at the top. And this compresses the highlights so it doesn't get blown out. So that seems fine for now. Let's go back to the Paranormal tutorial comp and let's try to add that texture to the text. So let's go back to the Element3D layer. Now we're gonna go over to custom texture maps and set that to the texture comp. And we want the texture comp to be off. Now let's open up scene setup. And in here, in order to apply the texture to the text, what we have to do is go over to the bevel. And down here, you can see it says diffuse. You can click on that and then load the texture as a custom layer 1, which is the custom layer that we set before. and then hit OK. Now it should appear here in the preview tab, and it also should appear in this box, but for some reason it doesn't. I don't know if this is a glitch only for me. A workaround that I came up with is, let's just go back, hit OK. You can see the composition, it shows up, but we need to be able to control the position, the stretching. Since we're not seeing the purple at the bottom here, we need to be able to do that in real time. So let's go back to the texture comp. We can go ahead and click Ctrl-Alt-S to save this as a texture. And let's just leave it at desktop, texture tutorial. Let's just make this a JPEG. And best settings, and just hit render. That took a long time. Then go back to the paranormal tutorial, go inside of the scene setup, back to the diffuse, and we're gonna just click on this one and find that texture. And click on that, and now it shows up, so we can hit OK, and now we can preview it in real time within Element. Let's just set up the UV mapping. In order to do that, we have to go back to the extrusion model and go down. You see this tab, it says UV mapping, and you can go ahead and select any of these to see what works best for you, but I found that plain XY was the best in this case. And then also I played around with the UV repeat. Let's set the X to maybe 3 and then the Y to maybe 3. Already you can tell what we're going for. Now of course you get these like stretches over here on the sides of the letters, but it's not really gonna be a problem that much. Also, you can use these UV offset values to just move this around. So you can see at the bottom here, if we just offset this and make it perfect at the bottom, also at the top. Now, if you zoom in here, you can see the textures, and you can also uncheck this draft textures so you can get even more detail. Now let's go ahead and click OK. Now, of course, it looks really dead right now, but we will be adding lighting and shading to this. Before we do that, let's just go back to the scene setup one more time and go to the bevel and set the texture back to the custom texture comp. And of course, it's not going to show in here, but once we go back to the comp, everything should be fine. And just to demonstrate, let's go to the texture comp, create a solid, and make a shape like that. Go back to the paranormal text. You can see that texture being updated live. So let's go back and delete that. And now let's go ahead and start getting this to look nice. First thing we can do is select the element layer and go inside of the render settings up here. And maybe go to ambient occlusion and turn that on. And what this does is basically just adds shading wherever there's contact between different objects, where objects are close to each other. So this just adds a bit of depth to it. There you go. With just a click of a button, it looks 2000 times better. Then we can go back to the comp and let's start creating some lights. So let's go up to layer, new, light, and let's name this backlight. And make it a point light and hit OK. And now what we can do is just position this light to be behind the text, because backlight is usually very important when it comes to 3D titles, because you want to have that sort of like edge light here that gives depth to it and makes it pop a bit more. So in order to make it a bit easier for us to position these lights, what we can do is use the views over here at the drop down list. So we can go on the top view. You can see this is our text. This here is our camera. The light is actually in front, so we can drag this back, and then we can go on the left side, drag this over here at the top, and go back to the active camera. And you can see now it creates this edge light, and that's what we want. So let's go down to the light options, and maybe we can increase the intensity. Maybe bring this down a bit. We can duplicate this now, and then bring this in front. And I think I added one light to this side, and then duplicate that and add one to this side. Just so we're here, something I noticed is there's this reflection of the light over here, like a specular. We want this material to be non-reflective. So what we can do is go over to the scene setup, and we'll play around with the material of the bevel. Let's go ahead and select the bevel, go down, increase the specular, but decrease the glossiness. The glossiness is pretty much the sharpness of the specular highlight. Let's just set this to 100 just to demonstrate and hit OK. You can see, since we increase the specular, it's even more visible. But when we go back to the scene setup, we can now decrease the glossiness to maybe 15%. And now it's really soft. Maybe name this left, name this right. These lights have a bit too much intensity, so kind of like that. Decrease this as well. And then we can have one more in the middle here, and we'll just make that very low. Next thing we can do is maybe add some color correction, control space on the Element3D layer, type in curves, and just maybe like darken it a bit, maybe like increase the highlights and just maybe even decrease the blacks altogether. And it's looking a bit too saturated now, so let's add a hue and saturation effect. Bring this down, try to shift the hue a bit towards a more cooler look. And if we zoom in here, let's make this full. You can see these bandings or like these edges that are very sharp, and this is called aliasing. And the way we can fix that within Element is by going up to Output, and there's this option called multi-sampling and super sampling. Maybe we can set this to 16. We can go down to super sampling and just set that to 4. And immediately you can see that we got a much cleaner edges. And then there's also the sampling and aliasing FXAA smoothing, which just smooths the edges altogether. Set that to 6. Becomes a lot more blurrier, but I wouldn't recommend this unless you really need it. So let's go back to 0 and go down here. You can set this render mode to preview. So what'll happen is whatever settings you're using, it'll just make sure to use lower ones just to speed up the process. Another thing we can do is add a glow effect to just make this pop that much more. Let's just turn it off for now. And over here at glow colors, instead of having original colors, we can just select A and B colors and select this one and maybe a darker green, because we don't want this purple color to glow at all. So let's turn it back on. You can see it only affects the green now. Let's just leave it there and then increase the radius quite a lot. Turn down the intensity to 0.4. Really subtle, but for me that's the best way to go with these details. Just make them really subtle so that they don't have a lot of attention compared to other elements in the shot. Let's go back to the project tab, and I have this forest kind of wallpaper. You can drag it down. It's actually really small, but it doesn't matter since we're going to be blurring it. By the way, I'm holding down shift to just scale it proportionally instead of like it going crazy. As you can see, the angle matches pretty nicely since it's from the ground and it's photographed towards the sky. So we got this low angle kind of look. And control space, add a curves effect, and control space, add a hue and saturation effect. And let's just bring this down, preserve the highlights, and just crush the blacks. And then over to the hue and saturation, let's just shift the hue so it matches with our text. Also, let's go ahead and add a fast blur, maybe make it like 2, bring it out of focus a bit. Let's click on the Element3D layer and let's talk a bit about the render settings. So before I talked about this aliasing problem, and we can fix that by simply increasing the super sampling and the multi-sampling. And then you got the ambient occlusion and the intensity, and you can even use ray traced ambient occlusion, but just beware, this is very slow and very heavy on your computer. And also sometimes the SSAO in some cases looks better instead of the ray traced. And then moving down, we got samples. If we preview this, if you look closely here, you can see this sort of like weird thing going on here at this edge, and that's because there's not a lot of samples for the ambient occlusion. So what we can do to fix that is set this to 64. Usually that's enough. And then you can set the multi-sampling of the ambient occlusion as well. It's maybe 4, and that should fix even more edge problems, as you can see here. Now let's create another adjustment layer and just make a color correction on top of everything. And let's control space curves and control space hue. Okay, now with all of those covered, let's go back to the original comp and see how close we actually got it. So brace yourselves. Oh my god. It's actually not much of a difference, but since I got to work on this really long time, got into the details and polished it a lot more. Let's make some more room here, and let's just press U to bring up all the keyframes. So the first thing I got is fade in. So I got a black layer here and just faded it out. Over here, this is the part where the lighting flash happens. So you can see I basically animated all of these lights come on and off, and then sometimes on the right side it's a bit brighter, on the left side it's a bit darker. Just give it a bit more variation. At this point, you can see it goes completely dark, and then the background goes very bright, and then it goes off, and then back to normal for the text as well, and then it continues. And if we go into the CC adjustment layer, you can see what kind of effects I added here. So you see we have a curves and a hue saturation, but I also used Lumetri color just to cool off the temperature and give it a bit of a negative tint. And then I use the film convert plugin, which is also a paid plugin, but you don't need to use that. You can just use a noise effect, because all I did was use this to add a bit of noise and a bit of texture to it. And also you can use the unsharp mask effect. So you can see it looks really soft without it. So basically what it does is sharpens the mask, but it's 10,000 times better than the sharpen effect. Alright guys, so that's it for the first part of this tutorial, but keep in mind that whatever you learn here, you should try to incorporate that into your own projects. Make sure to like sprinkle your own imagination and your own ideas into it, just to make it that much more original. With all that said, let's now move on to the second part of this tutorial. Alright, now moving on to the second part of this tutorial, I've already gone ahead and created a new composition using all the same settings as before. And let's click Ctrl T now, bring up the text tool and click and drag and just type in Hipster monster. And then the font I used for this one is called Monsters. Pretty convenient. and then Control Alt Home and Control Home to center this, and then maybe scale it up. Instead of using this text as a custom layer for Element3D, we can turn this into a solid and use masks instead. And the reason we need to do that is because in the original example, I added these sort of teeth to the O letter, and I also made this O letter a bit wider. Okay, so the way we can turn this into a mask is by simply right-clicking, create masks from text. There you go. And now we can go in here and maybe select this and click Ctrl T to transform and just scale it up. By the way, I'm holding down Shift to proportionally scale it. And also you can hold down Control to scale it from the anchor point. And then we can go in here and just add some points. We need one more. And then just drag these up, holding Shift to snap them vertically. And the cool thing about this is that now we can go in here and actually customize the look of this. So maybe we can align this T with this E and then align this R with this E. Let's go back to this E, and I think it's actually too close, and then this R as well. So just give it a bit more gap. And there you go, we have the design set. And let's create the Element3D layer. Let's Control Y, E3D, Control Space Element. And now we can go over to custom layers and custom text and masks and select the path of the monster layer and then just set this to masks. And now when we go to the scene setup, when we click extrude, boom, and you can see our little teeth right there. Now before we move on, let me go back to the original comp real quick and show you something. So let's go over to monster, and as you saw in the original animation, you can see that the O letter is its own group. And the M, S, T, E, R are their own group as well. So what I did to achieve that is, let's go back to the monster comp. What we can do, we can duplicate this layer. Just type in Mster, and this one should be the O. And now what I can do is just delete every other letter except for the O letter. And then in this one, delete the O letter and leave all the other letters. And now we can go back to the Element3D and set the custom path layer 2 to the O. Make that as a mask as well, and go back to the scene setup. And since this one is using the custom path 1 and we deleted the O, there's not gonna be an O here. But now let's just drag this off of the group. Let's delete that. We can right click and duplicate model, set this to group number 2, and then set the custom path to number 2 as well. Now we have the letter O in itself. So what this allows us to do is by going back, we can go over to the group 1 and then go over to create group null and then create that, have a null that is connected to these letters, which makes it easier for us to animate later on, and then go back to the element and create a group null for the group number 2 as well, and then just reposition that to be where we need it to be. Let's go over to Element3D and go over to the scene setup and now start playing with the look of these letters first, and then we can get to the animation part too. Let's bring up the bevel extrusion model 1 and let's just play around with this, and then what we can do later on is just copy this bevel and paste it over to this letter. Well, let's go over to the bevel, go over to the bevel options and maybe extrude this quite a bit, maybe something like, I don't know, 3. We can go back to the extrusion model. Let's make this bevel copies to 2, and the bevel copy number 2, we're just gonna decrease the extrusion, but we're gonna increase the Z offset so it goes in front of this. And then we can expand the edges inwards. And for this one, since it was all sharp and stuff, I just want to have bevel depth 0. Just set that to 0. And for this one as well, bevel segments to 0 and bevel segments to 0. Now for this second bevel, let's just leave it at white and maybe just make it a bit shinier and decrease the glossiness. Let's do the same for this bottom one. And for this one, let's just set it to like a cartoonish blue. Okay, now let's move on to the O letter, and what we can do is firstly, let's set the bevel copies to 2, and then we can go over here to the bevel one, right click, copy, go back here, right click, paste, and then over here, right click, copy, and right click, paste. So we got the same settings as on this one. Copy that and go back to the basic settings and paste. So we got identical settings for both of these groups. We can go ahead and hit OK, and you can see it updated in the composition. Now let's go ahead and quickly create a new camera, layer new camera. Let's make this 20, hit OK. And let's turn off these shapes because we don't really need to see them. And now let's create a new solid, call this background, and let's hit OK. And we can go ahead and add a gradient ramp effect. And let's just turn this off, turn it all off, just so we can grab the color from this and then make this one all the way to white. I have to turn it back on down here. Now we can maybe make it radial ramp. Let's bring it all the way at the bottom. Maybe sort of like that, and just drag this bottom point a bit. Maybe give it a bluer color, like a bright blue. Now let's reposition the text. Let's go ahead and create a new light. Make this an ambient light, just so it's not perfectly bright. Let's just make it to like 75%. Go back to the Element3D. So let's go over to the ambient occlusion, go over to render settings, ambient occlusion, and enable the SSAO. Increase the intensity quite a bit. Now, as for the shadow on the ground, what I did is let's go to the scene setup. I used 3ds Max to create this plane. And you can see it's already in here, so I can click OK, and then it imports over here. If you have 3ds Max, you can easily create this and then export it as an OBJ, because that's what Element3D uses. I'll just leave this in the project file so you can download it and it'll all be there. Okay, so now let's just bring this at the bottom. Set this at maybe group number 5. Right click, rename floor, hit OK. And now we can go over to group 5, create a group null. And let's rename this floor control. And let's rename these as well. Text control and O control. Now the floor should be below that. Let's scale this all the way. And the way we can make this disappear and only have the shadow appear is by doing this. So go back to the scene setup and under the material of the floor, go down all the way at the bottom and just check this option where it says matte shadow. So there you go. Let's go ahead and add another light. And let's make this point, increase this quite a bit and hit OK. And this is probably in front, so let's go at the top view. Sorry if I'm going a bit fast now, because we've already covered all of these in more detail with the first part. Now back to the lighting. Let's move this around, maybe go down and increase the light intensity. So you can see what that does over here. As I said before when I mentioned this lighting setup over here, and by doing this it doesn't really affect the composition. The way you can use this in the composition is by going down here and you can see it says lighting. You can drop that down, add lighting, and this is where you can add those pre-made lights. Maybe put it to single light, go over to additional lighting, you can control the brightness overall, and then you can rotate the light around so you can have this front side be a lot brighter than the back side. Now, if we zoom in here, we can see if we put this to full, we can see that the shadow on the ground is very blocky and very noisy, and that's because of the samples of the ambient occlusion. So you can easily fix that by going down to the ambient occlusion and set the samples up to 64, and that should make it nice and soft. And then you can increase the multi-sampling and go all the way down to the output as well. Set this to 16 and the super sampling to 4. Let's go ahead and create a new adjustment layer and let's just bring this on top. Let's rename this to CC and control space, add a curves adjustment. Maybe just add a bit of contrast to this so you can see it already makes it pop that much more. And then add a hue and saturation, maybe add some saturation to it. You can maybe even shift the hue like this. So you can instantly just get multiple colors without actually having to go change them in the Element3D layer. But anyway, let's go back to how it was. And then let's go ahead and create another adjustment layer. And let's call this vignette. Add a curves adjustment, bring this down, give it a bit more contrast. And what we can do now is select the ellipse tool and just double click. That'll create like a perfect circle depending on the composition size. And we'll set the mask to a subtract and we'll just hit F to bring up the feather and feather that like crazy. Now if we turn that on and off, you can see what difference it makes. It's really subtle, but it really helps focus our attention towards the center here. Okay, so I think as far as the design and the look of this goes, it's actually looking pretty nice. Of course, we can always come back to this and tweak it later if we're not happy with something or we want to make some changes or adjustments. But for now, let's just leave it at that and move on to the animation part. And for this one, I'm gonna do the same thing and cheat a little bit and just take you through the keyframes that I created in the original composition instead of just going over and redoing the whole animation. Now let's go over to the monster main comp that I did before. So as you can see, the camera kind of like comes out through this O letter's mouth and you can see the tooth and it's this sort of like growling, shaking animation. And then the other letters just come in together and you have this bouncy animation. You can see that the letter O is kind of like being squashed. And you can also see that they have these sort of like twist. And this was all created using Element3D's animation values. Let's go over to the composition, click U to bring up the keyframes. If we zoom in here using Alt and scroll wheel, you can see that I use this tint effect. And I keyframed it to go from 0 to 100 so that it tints the entire screen to red. And this was a really fast and easy way to tint the entire comp red instead of actually changing the color of this background or these letters and all that. And then from 100 it just slowly goes back to 0. I also use the optics compensation effect. And what this does, if we increase this just to demonstrate, Or you can uncheck this reverse and it makes it like a fisheye lens. But in this case, we'll just leave the reverse on. Actually, let's just Control Z everything. In the beginning, you can see it's more powerful, like you got 65% and you can't see the first keyframe because it's off the composition. So let's just select this one. It'll select all the keyframes and we can bring this over. So you can see there's the first keyframe at 92, but I push this over so that it starts at like 65. I have easing on this and also increase the keyframe velocity to maybe like 75%. Then let's take a look at the camera itself. So we got the camera and then I got a bunch of nulls here to add extra movement to the camera. So if we zoom in here, the main camera does this. So it's over here, goes in front of the O, and you can see I animated the position, the point of interest, also the zoom. When the camera is right here in front of the O, it says 1152. This is basically 11 millimeters. It's very wide. Click and drag, it's gonna go slow. And then hold down shift, it's gonna decrease or increase very fast. You can see if we go lower, it becomes wider. And if we go higher, it becomes more zoomed in. It's like 3000, that means it's 30 millimeters. And the reason I add extra nulls to add extra movement to the camera is that when it comes here, you can see that this camera comes to a stop right here. But if you have another null and attach this camera to that null, you can add some movement to that null going from the front here a bit backwards. So it doesn't just stop. So like comes here, boom, stop, and then starts moving again. And then I have another extra null here that has some more movement to it. If you go over to the end here, let's just unlink this from this null. You can see it just stopped over here. And it didn't move at all anymore. But if we have this linked, what happens is after it stops, it actually keeps on going a bit more and it just slowly eases into the stop. Now, of course, you can use keyframes and mess around with those so that you don't have many keyframes to worry about. But this is the way that I like to do it. Now, moving down, what I did with the O Control Extra, I played around with the rotation a bit. And then the position too, and then the scale here. This point is very important because you can see that the scale goes from 87 over to 102, and then it goes back to 100. That gives it this sort of like bouncy look. And at the same time, it looks as if these letters are squashing the O letter. I also animated the properties within the Element3D layer. So you can see down here, what I did is I played around with a bunch of these keyframes from the deform section. So let's go over to group 1. And go down to particle look and deform, put down the twist. You can see what the twist does on the x-axis. So I simply animated it to do this. And then I animated the scatter and the XY displays, and you can find these just by simply right clicking and then reveal in effect controls. So it'll take you right there. So it's under multi-object and we got displace XYZ, we got the size randomness. I played around with that as well. So as you can see, there's just a bunch of keyframes that were added because I worked on this animation for about 2 hours, I think, just to get it to flow properly and make it look as interesting as possible. Okay, so I think we've covered pretty much everything that I did in the original example. So now we can move on to the third part of this tutorial, which is the Toy Story inspired 3D title. And we can go ahead and check that out real quick. And for this one, we're only going to be walking through some specific things that I did that are kind of like unique and different because it's pretty much the same principle and the same techniques used, but to a more extreme level. So let's check it out. Okay, so let's scroll down, and first off, let me just let you know that this one was created using 3 copies of Element. And the reason for that was because Element3D only supports 5 groups, and because I wanted to have control over each of these letters and each of these outlines of these letters and this box as well, that meant that I was not going to be able to fit all of these elements into different groups, because then that way I would need to have more than 10 groups. And that's the reason why I had to split all of these. And of course, this is really heavy on the PC, and I actually had to render these out separately and then composite them back together in another comp. So I basically had to turn these 2 off, render this layer, and then turn this one off, render this layer, and then turn this one off and render this layer, and then compose them back all together after they were rendered. Now if we scrub through and go back to the beginning just to check out the animation, what you can see here is that the animation is very bouncy. That was the look I was going for, so let's give that a quick preview. You can see that the animation is very bouncy. You can tell how they just extrude more than they should and then they retract back into place. And if we click U to bring up the keyframes, you can see that it's actually not that complicated. Like you got 2 keyframes for each of these letters. This is the M control, then you got the M outline control, the Y control, Y outline control, and so on and so forth. We got the force opacity down here, and the reason I did this, and the force opacity basically allows you to control the opacity of all these letters or all these objects or these groups. Shift them over and you can see what they look like. Since I'm going in the negative on the scale, it's gonna flip and also go extrude backwards. And then the force opacity right at this frame goes to 100%. Let's just Control Z and undo those force opacity keyframes. And you can see at this point, the border pops up. And so that's the reason behind these force opacity keyframes. Now I'm going to show you real quick how I decided to separate these letters into different layers. So let's go over to my element and go over to the scene setup. And this is how I set it up. So we got the M letter and it's on group 1. Then we got the M outline on group 3. Then we got the Y letter on group 2. And then we got the Y outline on group 4. Real quick to demonstrate how I did the outline. It's actually pretty easy if we go to the outline material. What I did is I simply just checked this bevel outline enable. As soon as I had one of these letters set up with a fill and the outline, I just duplicated them multiple times, changed the custom path to be set to the path that I actually wanted. So in this case, it's the custom path 1 because that's where the M letter is. And then for the Y, I had custom path 2. And seeing as Element only supports 5 groups, this was perfect. So we got the M outline, Y outline, that's 4 layers. And I also had the holder and I made that as a matte shadow. So if you go here, you go down, you can see that the matte shadow is checked. And therefore, since it's coming into contact with the box, I had to have that in the same element layer as well. And in fact, this box element is in all 3 of these Element3D layers. So if you go here to the Element3D toy, go into scene setup, you can see here we got the holder. It's not a matte shadow because we need to see it on this one. And then we got the T, O, and Y, and all of these have no outline, it's just a fill, and therefore we only have to use 4 groups. And again, all of these are linked to null objects, and all of these have been named. So you can see it's T control, O control, Control Shift H, by the way, to toggle the UI, so we can see where the controls are. Other than that, we can maybe talk a bit about the look of these letters. So you can see it's pretty shiny and it's pretty reflective. So let's go over to the, say, my element and then go into the fill material. So I have the reflectivity up to 15%. I even put some illumination intensity into it to like pop a little bit more. So I put it to 30% and also chose the same color as the diffuse color. I even added some diffuse to it just to make it pop that much more. And then I just copied all of these material options and pasted them over to all of these other ones. So let's go back to the comp. You can see that there's a shadow being cast on the ground. The way I did that is by basically putting the backlight to cast shadows. So you got the cast shadows here on. Also, if you go a bit closer here, you may notice that there's a bit of glow going on in these letters. And that's because there is. So let's select this element layer and go down. Under the render settings, we can find the glow. If we turn that off, you can see the difference. Basically, this glow is the same as the glow effect that After Effects has, but it's a lot faster, and you can also have some very specific effects when it comes to Element3D itself. For example, here we got glow from luminance, and instead of having that, which is going to affect the entire title, it's only going to affect the illuminated elements. Let's go back to the scene setup. When I told you about the illumination that I added, 30% intensity, if this were 0, there's no glow whatsoever because it's not illuminated. Then the glow is actually coming from the illumination, so it's not going to have any effect in this case. So let's Control Z. And then moving on, you got some glow radius, you got glow intensity, pretty self-explanatory. And then you got glow aspect ratio. And this one is pretty cool because if I increase this, let's turn these 2 other ones off and zoom in. And let's just increase the intensity. Just to demonstrate, you can see if we increase this, the glow becomes much more stretched out horizontally, kind of like a anamorphic lens would make it look like. So let's bring it back to 2, intensity of 0.6 or whatever it was. Also, if we go down all the way at the bottom here under output, you can see that we have the multi-pass mixer. And what I did in this case is I increased the reflectivity, and all of these options are global. So whatever you change here will affect the entire objects that are within these groups of this certain element layer. I even added some illumination, as you can see. Alright, so I think that's pretty much it, and we're finally done with the third part of this tutorial as well. Excuse me if you actually expected to go a bit more in depth, but I did try to make this as short as possible while at the same time making it as informative as possible, but also at some points maybe try to go a bit faster or maybe even skip some things, since we did cover a lot of things in the first part and then we got the second part as well. So once you get these steps laid out and the process and the techniques, I'm pretty sure you can follow along pretty easily and then end up creating your own stuff and experiment and do whatever it is that you need in order to get the best result possible for what it is that you're doing. With all that out of the way, let's now move on to the outro of this video. Alright guys, thanks for watching and being patient all the way through. Consider subscribing and hitting that bell button to be notified whenever a new video comes out. If you want to follow my work or ask me any questions personally, then you can find me on Instagram. If you have any suggestions, then leave a comment down below. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time.